Good. Well, hey, if we have not met before, this is your first time worshiping with us today. My name is Chris. I'm the associate pastor, and I am so glad to be here with you this morning. I don't know about you, but it's been a crazy month here just getting through May. Our weather is finally heating back up, which is not great. I don't know about you. I love that 80-degree weather, and I was enjoying it, but it's Texas, and every good thing has its day, right? Well, speaking about good weather, about 6 weeks ago, Adam, the guy that was just up here a second ago, one of our pastors and I, we were getting ready to film Clay Thomas's story for Easter. And when we were prepping to film his video, we knew that it was important for us that we wanted to capture one of Clay's most favorite hobbies is fishing. And so when we were doing that, we were kind of thinking about where would we do that. And I don't know about you, but I think about the fact that we kind of live in like a concrete jungle that is Houston. And so all I could think about was like, man, if we're gonna find a spot to film him to fish, like we're gonna be driving at least an hour to get somewhere secluded enough that it makes sense. And so we texted Clay and we're like, hey, we're looking for a spot. And he actually texted us back and said, well, actually, I've got this spot that's right off Highway 6. And I remember thinking, I was like, Highway 6? I was like, dude, there's gonna be way too much noise. Like there's no way that that's gonna work for us. It's not gonna be secluded. We're gonna get out there and you're gonna have all the noise from the cars and the people and just the chaos of the city. Like there's no way this is gonna work. But we're like, let's give it a shot anyway. So we go out there and we pull up, and of course we pull right off the highway. And at first I'm thinking the same things. I'm like, yep, it's exactly what I thought. There's all this noise, there's all this chaos. But we go ahead and we get ready to film because the very first part of filming we didn't need the audio from. We just had to film Clay walking down to the spot where he was gonna fish. And at the start of this trail, there's this dam that's not crazy tall. It's probably like 20, 30 feet high. And the start of the trail, you gotta walk up the dam and back down it to get down to the pond that we were at. And so as you walk towards this dam and you get to the top of it, there was this point, this kind of threshold when you got right at the top that all of the noise got louder. So all of the chaos and craziness of the city actually amplifies because you're higher up, and then you start to walk down. And what I noticed happened as you would walk down this dam is the further you would go, the quieter it would get. And the further you went, the quieter, and so forth. Until you got down to the bottom, and as soon as you hit the bottom of this hill, peace. All you could hear was the sounds of nature. And so all of this chaos and craziness of the city just went completely silent. And we didn't walk a mile. I mean, when I say we walked maybe 200 feet. And I remember I was just blown away in that moment because all I could think about was how on earth could something so peaceful exist in the midst of something so chaotic. Well, if you have your Bibles or Bible apps today, you can go and open them up to Psalm 23. That's where we're going to be this morning. And we are wrapping up our series, The Good Life, today, where we've been talking about mental health. And today, I want to talk to you a little bit about anxiety. And I don't know about you, but anxiety is one of those things that I think we often struggle with. And as we prepped for The Good Life, the reason we called this series this is that I think so often we have this misinterpretation of what Romans 8:28 is. And so we just read a second ago, but we'll read it again. It says, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The real issue is that we often take this verse at face value. And so we kind of get this idea that if we just have a relationship with Jesus, then everything in our life has to automatically be good. And so if we follow Jesus, we're gonna have financial success, we're gonna have health, and we're gonna have prosperity. But that's not really what this verse talks about. This verse is not a promise that every individual thing in our life will be good, but it's the assurance that God will use everything in our life, the good, but also the messy and broken parts, to make something beautiful, something truly good. And so it's for us to remember that we get to trust that God's ways are better than our ways, and that if he is a good God, then everything will work out according to the plan that he has for us. But the question that arises in that is, if God intends for us to have the good life, where does anxiety fit into that? If God promises a peace that surpasses understanding, how can that exist in the chaos and stresses of life? Well, I don't think there's a better passage to talk about anxiety than Psalm 23, because it was written by David, and David was not only a man after God's own heart, but what you may not know is that David struggled with anxiety. In fact, there was a biblical scholar and author who talked about David this way. His name was Joe Carter. He said, out of all the people in the Bible, there's probably no one who was more afflicted by fear and anxiety than King David. Fear and anxiety were for him like constant companions. And so we really can't understand David or his Psalms without understanding his anxiety and fear. And that's what's gonna make David's words in the Psalm so powerful, is that for him, anxiety was real, and it was a big struggle that he dealt with. But David also knew that his God was bigger than the struggles in his life. And so he knew that if he could trust him and follow him, that everything would be okay. And so I think for many of you, where you find yourself this morning is probably in this place where anxiety feels like this impossible thing to overcome, like it's something you can't change. And I think more often than not, we find ourselves asking that same question I did at the bottom of the dam, is how can something so peaceful really exist in something so chaotic and stressful? And so that's what I want to talk about with you today, is that there is a path to peace that God provides. And as we study Psalm 23 today, I hope that you see that God not only provides relief from our anxieties, but he offers peace in the situations that overwhelm us. And so we're going to start by looking at verse 1 this morning. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." Now, this is a really personal touch from David, because you've got to remember that early in David's life, he was a shepherd. And being a shepherd, it's not an easy job. This is not just some young boy who dealt with fluffy sheep and frolicked in the meadows. The shepherd had to protect from lions, wolves, and bears. They were a fierce protector who fended off the worst dangers. And so as he starts this psalm, this is how David says that he views God, as a mighty shepherd who protects him. And I want you to notice there's a different distinction specifically in the way he talks about God, that David doesn't just say that he is a shepherd, he says that God is his shepherd. And this is a really important distinction to make, because this is not just some optimistic idea of God, but David says this is his experience, that as he recalls all the way that God has impacted his life, he starts simply with, he is my protector. That in the midst of all of the struggles that David faced, that he could have never handled on his own, David says simply, God was with me and God kept me safe. And so as we look at Psalm 23, we have to start with an understanding that God is not some distant spirit in the sky, that he's a deeply, intensely personal God who wants an intimate relationship with us, but more than that, he's a God that intervenes in our life, that in our moments of deepest need and despair, he is there to protect us and provide for us. And so we have to understand that to understand this psalm. And I don't think there's any greater proof that God doesn't just leave us on our own than Jesus himself. That when we wrecked our relationship with God through sin and left this world a broken, marred mess, that Jesus intervened in our place, that he saved us through his death and resurrection. In fact, Jesus goes on to call himself the Good Shepherd in John 10:11. He says, "I am the Good Shepherd, and the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." It's the God we worship. He's a God who cares. He's a God that doesn't just leave us to our own mess, but that he helps us, that he intervenes in our life. And if the Good Shepherd would intervene in our greatest spiritual crisis, will he not help us in our daily struggles? And see, this is what David is saying in this first verse, that if God really is his shepherd, then there's nothing that he needs, that he knows he can trust that he's got everything to be taken care of because God will protect him and provide for him. And I know maybe for many of you in here, you find yourself in a different place, that maybe you do feel like anxiety is something you can't overcome, that you feel like it's weighing down on you. And maybe you're in this place where you feel like you're all alone and you feel like God doesn't care about you. But I want you to know that's not true. That you're not alone and that God does care about you. That he knows you. He knows your deepest and innermost struggles. And what I will promise you is that a life with God, he will protect you and he will provide for you. He will not leave you on his own because he is a good God. And if the God who defeated sin and death is our shepherd, then he can defeat your anxiety because he did it for David and he'll do it for you. He's David's shepherd and he is your shepherd. All right, look with me at our next verse. This is the first half of verse 2. David says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. So the first path to peace that David begins to describe, and so he starts off this psalm, right, with an explanation of who God is. He says, God is my shepherd, God gives me peace. And he starts to talk to us about how we get that peace. And so the first way, that he says that he does that is that God leads him to green pastures. And I want you to pay careful attention to the language that he uses here. He doesn't say God leads me to the greenest pastures in all of the land. He says God leads me to green pastures. And this is a picture of God's provision that David said he provides for me, and whatever he provides for me, it's enough. The problem with this, though, is that we have a culture and a society that tells us that your life is never enough. That there's always something better to aspire to be. There's always something better to strive for, something better to grind for, and something better to work for. And while there's not really a problem with like setting goals or having self-improvement, the problem with this is that we so often take it to the extremes, and it leads to what I believe is one of the largest factors in anxiety, is discontentment. I call this the greener pasture phenomenon. The reality is that for most of us here in Katy, Texas, we live pretty blessed lives. Most of us have a job, a roof over our heads. We have many comforts in life that a lot of people don't have. Now, the problem with that is that for the vast majority of us, there are also a ton of people around us who are doing way better than we are. And it's really easy to start comparing your life to the people around you. And if we're not careful, what ends up happening is this game we play, we go, yeah, I think I have a green pasture. Man, their pasture looks a lot greener than mine does. And that's the pasture I want. And what we end up doing is we get down this trap of the comparison spiral. And we don't realize that happens is over time as we do this discontentment that we have with our life, it will deepen and it darkens into an anxiety that makes us question our worth, question our future, and question our place in this world. And this isn't just something biblical, this is something that research backs up. In a 2024 study published by the Frontiers in Psychology journal, they found that individuals with anxiety spent the majority of their time making what they call upward comparisons, which was viewing themselves as not measuring up to others, coupled with a negative view of their life. And so basically what happens is they look at everyone else, they say their life is better, my life is horrible. And it says in response to this, every single individual that they studied, when they made these kind of comparisons, every single time, they experienced significant decrease in their mental health. And so in other words, every time they made these comparisons, their mental health got worse and worse and worse. And I'm sure that some of you were thinking like, look, I get it. Like, I bet David could be content. If I was a king writing poems from my rooftop, I wouldn't be comparing my life to anyone else's either. Like, I bet he did see green pastures. But David's life was marked with struggle too. Before David was a king, he spent years as a fugitive hiding from Saul when he chased him trying to kill him. And even as a king, he experiences betrayal, rebellion from his children, the death of his children, and the consequences of his sin and failure. This is not a man that had a perfect life. In fact, in Psalm 55, David goes so far as to say that he wishes he had wings like a bird, that he could fly away and escape his pain. He knew what it was like to want a different pasture. Yet the same man goes on to say in Psalm 23, I lack nothing. See, what changes for David is not his circumstances. The pasture doesn't get any greener for him. But there is a shift in his perspective, and it's the same shift that we have to make. And so you have to recognize that your green is good. And so what this means is that we have to stop looking at what everyone else has, and we have to learn to be content with what we have. Because if we spend all of our time looking over the fence at everybody else's life and wishing that that's what we looked like, we end up exchanging gratitude for the envy, for the discouragement and discontentment, and it leads to the anxiety. But David says, man, there's a better way. He says true contentment is not found in having everything we think we need, but it's in recognizing that what God gives us is what we need. It's an understanding and a focus on the promise that the shepherd gives exactly what kind of pastures his sheep need. And so if you ever want to overcome anxiety, one of the first things you have to work to do is you have to work towards contentment. Listen, you will wear yourself out and wear yourself down playing the comparison game and chasing after these green pastures. And so you can't do it. You can't hope that your life is just automatically going to be better if you just look at what everyone else has and be like, I just wish I had that. That does nothing but tear us down. And I get it. I know that life's not perfect. And I'm sure for some of you, you'd say, Chris, I probably have a few more brown patches than anybody else in my life. But what God provides it's good. And it may not be everything we always want, but it's everything we need. So don't exhaust yourself chasing after the greener pastures, but be thankful for the green that God has provided for you. And if you can practice that contentment, you will begin to find peace in your anxiety. All right, look with me to our next verse. These are verses 2 and 3. He goes on to say, he says, he leads me beside quiet waters and he refreshes my soul and he guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. So the second path to peace that David says God provides is he leads him beside quiet waters. Now, what you may not know about sheep is that sheep cannot rest unless they have 4 very specific criteria met. So they have to feel safe from threats, free from conflict, unbothered by pests, and not hungry. Sounds like most of us. And even more, sheep will not drink from rushing water. So if there's like rapids going on, they're afraid of it, they won't touch it. And so the only way a sheep can find rest is if they're led somewhere where there is a calm stream. And so David says this is the way that God provides for him. Now, we got to be honest, David's life is marked with chaos. He knew what it was like to spend his life having tons of threats and all kinds of different things. And it's really easy to look at his life and go, much of it I would probably characterize like these frightening, fast rushing waters. He says, but even in the midst of all of that God still led him to moments of peace and quiet where he could rest and he can restore and find peace in God. And the same thing's true for us. Now, the problem with this is that so often we're like sheep. If you don't know this, sheep are not really good at finding places of rest, and neither are we. If we're left on our own, more often than not, we end up involving ourselves in environments and activities that actually increase our anxiety instead of reducing it. And so like sheep, we have to be led to the quiet waters. And so I want to give you 3 ways that you can work on this specifically today. And so here's the first one, is that you need to limit your social media consumption. Now, what you may not know is that the average American, this is not just children, this is adults, spends 7 hours on their phone. That's 5 hours more than the average recommended screen time by professionals. And it gets worse for teenagers. So teenagers in the room, 41% of you say that your screen time is probably 8 hours and higher. That's nuts. We are obsessed with our phones, and we're obsessed with social media. Has it changed a lot and done a lot of good? Yeah. But what you don't realize is that it's also making us more anxious as a society. And a lot of this is due to what's called the negativity bias. So we have this part of our brain that's the fear center. And it's called the amygdala. And what the amygdala does is it prioritizes negative or threatening information 5 times more than it processes positive information. And so what this means is your brain is constantly looking for negative and threatening things. And when it finds them, what it does is actually triggers a dopamine response in your brain, which is a good thing. That's like a reward. And so what your brain does is it rewards you for finding negative things. Now, when that's healthy, it has its good purposes. So if you're in the woods and you're walking and you see trees and you see leaves and you spot a snake, your brain goes, do not step on the snake. Dopamine hit, you're rewarded. And so now you're constantly thinking about it. You're like, I probably don't want to step on snakes. That's good. But the problem is this can also get to an unhealthy place where the brain tricks itself into constantly needing the next dopamine hit. And so what it will do is it will put itself in this habitual cycle of destruction where you intentionally or even subconsciously seek out negative and threatening, anxiety-producing articles and news so that your brain gets a dopamine hit and you're rewarded for it. And it leads you to go, well, I need more, and I need more, and I need more, and I got to find more. So if you've ever heard the term doom scrolling when talking about social media, this is where this comes from. And what you may not realize is social media, it is tailored specifically in its algorithms to suck you into it. And so if you ever think social media was created for you, you're believing a lie. It was created for the companies that made it. It was created for their agendas. It's created to push products. And they do not care at all about your mental health. All they care about is that you spend more time on your screen. And so what I will promise you is if you are somebody that thinks that you are escaping your anxieties and your problems in life by scrolling endlessly in hours for social media, you are wrecking your mind. Because for every article or video that you think is cute or funny, there is another one that is triggering this fear center in your brain, and you don't even realize it. And it is having devastating effects on us as a society. So the question is, well, what do we do? The simplest answer is that we limit our time on social media. And I want you to see this. There was a study done in 2023 by the Journal of Affective Disorders that found that people who limited social media to just 30 minutes a day reported significant decreases in anxiety and depression after just 3 weeks. Think about that. These are people that struggle with something they feel like they can't get rid of. And for many of them, in 3 weeks, they experience peace for the first time in a long time. What would 3 weeks do for you? What would it look like if you limited social media for 3 months or a year? Maybe for some of you, it could be the first time you have real peace in a long time and you didn't even know why. But whatever that looks like for you, don't let social media control your mind. Limit your time on it, set healthy boundaries, get control back of your mind, and let God lead you to the quiet waters. Now, here's the second way that we can find quiet waters, and this one's a little bit more simple. It's spend time in nature. So if you'll notice on the first half of this, when we spend time consuming our time with man-made things, our anxiety rises. And what actually we find in it's not only scripture, but in research is that when we spend time in God's creation, we actually experience peace. In fact, there was a study done, a systematic review of 92 different studies that found when individuals participated in any kind of nature-based activity, that they experienced significant decreases in their depression and anxiety. So what that means for you is that any kind of exposure outside is really good for your health. It's good for your cognitive function, and it improves your mental health. And what I'm not telling you need to do is like go sell everything you have and move to a cottage in the woods, even if some of you are like, that sounds like the perfect life. But what I am telling you is spend some time outside this week. And I want to challenge you specifically. What I would do is spend just 20 minutes in nature one day this week. And I get some of you are probably thinking, Chris, remember how you talked earlier about the concrete jungle that we live in? Where do I find that? I'm not telling you you have to go like to a pine forest or drive all the way to California. You can do that if you want. What I would challenge you to do is go to a park. Put your phone in do not disturb. Spend 30 minutes out in God's creation. Pray and enjoy what he made for you. Because when we go to the quiet waters that God has led us to, we're restored. I mean, do you understand that's what creation was in the first place? We got put into a garden to enjoy it. And so this creation, no matter what we've turned it into, was originally made for our benefit. And the benefit from that is that we find rest and we find peace. So spend some time in nature today and see if that doesn't help you. Now, here's the third way that we can work on this. We can find quiet waters if we avoid sin. Now, I think we kind of like the thrill of rushing water that sin is. And I equate this kind of like whitewater rafting. I don't know if any of you have ever done that before. It's a lot of fun. It's exhilarating. But I would say 99 times out of 100, there's a crash. And that's fine, you know. But the same thing happens with sin. The rapids are great until there's a crash. And there will be a crash. Sin has devastating consequences in your life. It does. And so whether you realize it or not, your sin may be one of the things that is contributing the largest way to your anxiety. And I think the reality is that the reason this happens is that a lot of us not only live in sin, we hide our sin. And what I will promise you is that if we keep our sin in the dark, we will never find peace. I can't tell you how many people I know that have walked through an affair, or they have struggled with addictions, or have any kind of habitual sin in their life that they try to keep secret. But I will tell you, it is the furthest thing from peaceful you will ever experience. Because think about it. I mean, you're constantly freaking out. You're constantly trying to hide things. You're trying to put on a face like there's nothing wrong. You're afraid that people are going to find out. There is no peace in that. There are no quiet waters in the secrecy and habit of sin. In fact, David knew this. He talked about it in Psalm 32, and he wrote Psalm 32 after his adultery with Bathsheba, and he murdered Uriah. And I want you to listen to what he said about this. He said, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. David discovered sin and peace don't coexist. That his sin was a rushing water that had put a barrier between him and God and him and peace. And it wasn't until he confessed his sin and turned away from it that David truly rested. And so if you want the quiet waters that God offers, we have to let go of our sin. We've got to be honest about our sin. And so what that's going to mean is that we would confess our sin, we would turn away from it, because sin will keep you in the raging waters of anxiety. But if you can let go of it and cling to the shepherd, he will lead you to quiet waters. And so in a relationship with him in obedience, there is peace that brings true rest to our soul and to our minds. All right, look with me at our last verse today. These are verses 4 through 6. He says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So the final path to peace that David reveals is probably the most important. That peace isn't just about God's provision. It's not just about peaceful places, but David says that probably the most important thing that he recognizes is that it's God's presence that brings him peace. And I want you to pay attention to the language shift that David makes here. That in the first half of this psalm, David speaks about God, and he speaks about completed events, things that have already happened. But when you get to verses 4 through 6, there's this shift where David is now writing as he's in the valley, and he no longer speaks about God, he speaks to God. And so what this is David recognizing that God is right there with him, walking through the darkest moment in his life. And David goes, man, if he is the shepherd, if he is my good shepherd, he says, then everything's okay. And David goes on to talk about what it's like for God to walk through this valley with him. And he uses the imagery of a rod and a staff of a shepherd to protect him. And this is really important because the rod and the staff, they actually serve two different purposes. So the rod, its main purpose is correction. And it's still true today that one of the ways that God helps us overcome anxiety is that he helps us to correct our thought patterns and our actions and the ways that we think and do things. And that's what we've talked about for most of the message today. But it's really this back half that things are different, that the staff is completely different from the rod. Because where the rod is used for correction, the staff is protection. And so what they would do with the staff, it had a crook on the end of it, and they could actually use it to guide sheep along difficult paths or pull them back from danger if they needed to. And it's here that David chooses to end his psalm. He says, you're with me, and if you're with me, I'm safe. And that's an easy thing to say on the other side of the valley, right? Like if you're in the good spot, that's easy, but David's in the valley. The darkness isn't some distant memory, but this is where he finds himself in this moment. And I think for so many of you, this is where you feel like you are with your anxiety. Maybe it feels like the valley of death. Maybe you feel like you're alone, like there's nothing you can do about it, there's no one to help you, and that God doesn't care about you. But I want you to know that's not true. That the shepherd is with you. And if he's with you in the valley, it changes everything. It doesn't necessarily mean that the valley goes away right away, but it does change our walk through the valley. See, David doesn't find peace here because he gets out of his struggles. He finds peace when he experiences his relationship with God through them. And so David writes 5 simple words. He says, for you are with me. Those 5 words completely transformed David's valley. And they can transform yours too. I think one of the biggest ways that we have to work on this is that more often than not, we have to remind ourselves of God's presence. Because let's be honest, it's really easy to see the green pastures when life is good. It's different when life is hard. Because when life is hard and we're focused on whatever's happening in front of us, we can miss so much of what God's doing and completely forget what it is that God's done in the past. And so I think one of the biggest ways that we can work on finding peace in the valley is to look for the green in the barren. Because what I will promise you is that even in the moments where we don't feel like it, God is there and God is working and he is providing for you and offering you the good life, even in the moments we don't feel like it. And so maybe you're somebody whose job, you just feel like it's wrecking you right now. I mean, you're struggling, you're angry, you don't like it, you want to quit. Remind yourself it's a job that God provided, pays the bills. Parents, when you've got disobedient children, and I'm not just talking about they talk back a little bit, but like when you've got those kids that you have exhausted every option, nothing seems to work, and you feel like you're on your last limb. Remind yourselves that children are a blessing that God provides, that not everybody gets to have that blessing. Husbands, when your wife has asked you to take out the trash 18 times and you're annoyed, remind yourself, God gave you a woman that wanted to marry you, and that is a miracle in and of itself. A little less serious, but the point remains the same. We have to look for green in the barren. Are there moments in our life where things are hard? Absolutely. And are there moments where it looks like everything around us is dry bones? Yes. But even in the most barren places, there is green that God provides. And it means that we have to look for it. One of the ways I would encourage you to work on this is make a list for all the ways that God's been there in your life. And that can be good things and big things, like maybe you're somebody that God restored your faith after a season of doubt where you questioned everything. Or maybe it's something simple like you had bills to pay and the right amount of money showed up unexpectedly at the random time and you couldn't really explain it, you just know it happened and it was God. Everything in between. Make a list of those things, and what I would encourage you to do is take them, pray about them every single day. And I know that sounds simple, but what I will promise you is if you can do this, it brings peace. In fact, Paul talked about it this way in Philippians 4:6-7. He said, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." And notice what Paul says here. He doesn't say, just pray about your circumstances, just whatever you feel like saying to God, just say it to God. He's very specific in what he tells you to do here. He says, pray with thanksgiving. And what Paul is saying is that if we are consistent to pray and give thanks to God for all the ways that he's provided for us, all the ways that he has been there in our life, Paul says the natural result of that consistent prayer is that there is a peace, a supernatural peace that we can't explain, we don't understand it, we just know that it's better than anything this world offers. He says that peace of Jesus will guard your hearts and minds. And I want you to understand I'm not discrediting medicine and doctors and practical applications, because I think all those things can be very important. And for some people, I think they're essential tools to fighting and overcoming depression and anxiety and all of these things, because I believe that the Good Shepherd uses many ways to heal his sheep. And so I think that doctors and medication and therapists and all of these things, they're wonderful. But do not neglect the supernatural healing and the supernatural peace that is found in the presence of Jesus. Because there is something that happens when we are in prayer, when we're in worship, when we're meditating scripture, and we're constantly in biblical community, that it changes something inside of us that we can't explain and we can never manufacture with worldly things. Paul knew it. He said, I can't explain what it is. I just know that I have peace no matter what happens to me. And David knew it. David says, if you were my shepherd, I lack nothing. There's nothing I need, that I am protected as long as I'm with you. And so for David, peace had nothing to do with his circumstances changing, but it had everything to do with his heart and his mind finding a shelter in God's presence. And that same shelter, it's available to you. Check out this video.
Hi, I'm Hannah Hallback. I'm Chris's wife, and this is my story. When Chris and I moved here 3.5 years ago, it was really challenging because it was a big change for me. I had lived in Georgia my entire life, so moving, driving distance about 13 hours away, and more realistically flying a 2.5-hour flight anytime I want to go home and visit. That was really challenging and anxiety provoking. I'd never been that far away from home more than just a couple of days and for vacation, and so it was a big life change. While it was exciting and I was ready to experience something new and what God had for Chris and I, it was hard to leave my family. I was unable to see any good that was coming of us being here in Texas because I was just focused solely on the fact that I wasn't back home where I felt safe and where I felt secure. So about the first 12 months, I was stuck in a really deep hole of depression. Over the last 2 years, I've worked through a lot of my depression, and I feel like now I am on the other side of that hill. But I realized after coming out of the depression that I struggle with a lot of anxiety. There was a little bit of a shock that I even had symptoms of anxiety, which is why I didn't realize it for quite some time after I had pulled myself out of being so depressed. One of the first moments that I realized that I struggled with anxiety was around Christmas time last year, in the months leading up to Christmas. As we were preparing to go home and visit my family, my grandpa's not been in great health the last year. He had been in and out of the hospital. My family, my mom and dad told me that coming into Christmas after Thanksgiving, they told us that it was important for us to be there this Christmas because they were pretty sure it was going to be his last. I remember there were a lot of moments where I didn't want to pick up the phone to call anybody in my family, but especially my grandpa. I was anxious about making plans to come home, even though I desperately wanted to see him. And then a day or two before we were leaving to go to Georgia for Thanksgiving, I had a panic attack because I think I was just faced with the reality that I was going to have to see him. And I had to face the emotions that came along with that, and the anxiety rose with the thought of the emotions and having to deal with them and having to see him and the reality of the situation that I was walking into. I did go home that Thanksgiving and that Christmas to see him, and I'm thankful that I did. He's thankfully fine. He's better and has overcome what he was going through at that time, and his health has significantly improved, and I am very grateful. But it took a lot of strength and a lot of courage that I didn't think that I had, and honestly I still don't think that I had that. I think that came from the Lord. So anxiety is still something that I struggle with now. More recently, something that I find myself struggling with is the thought that I'm not, or the feeling that I'm not a good enough wife. And every time Chris and I would talk about those things, he would constantly meet me with reassurance that those things weren't true. I feel like being depressed led to a lot of deep-rooted anxieties and feelings and thoughts that I'm not good enough, but things have gotten better. I think I have found ways to cope and manage it in a healthy way. The biggest thing that has helped me in managing my anxiety has been my relationship with Jesus. Over the last 2.5 years, I've really put in an effort to seek him in multiple different ways and to put effort into growing our relationship and my relationship with him. And one of the biggest things, or the biggest thing that has come out of that growth in that relationship with Jesus is peace. Anxiety doesn't have to be the end of your life. It doesn't define you as a person, and it doesn't have to dictate your life, because there's peace in Jesus.
The valley of anxiety, more often than not, it's not a quick journey. And it's not easy. Sometimes it takes years, and sometimes there are days where you feel like maybe you're never going to make it out of the valley. But what makes all the difference is knowing that Jesus is right there with us, walking as the good shepherd in the valley with us. Yeah, I love the way that Hannah ended that video. She said, there is peace in Jesus, and we can testify that in our life, that this is not a struggle that we're out of completely, but it's getting better. And sure, there are tons of great practical ways that have done that, but the biggest thing is that my wife has found peace in her relationship with Jesus. And that same thing is going to be true for you. That the peace found in Jesus, it's not about an absence of struggle. It's not about getting all the practicing and application right. It's about resting in the promise that Jesus is with us and he protects us as he walks with us through our struggles. Yeah, I love the way that David, he ends this psalm. He says, surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I don't know about you, but I love that. Because for David, God's presence wasn't just some temporary comfort that he called on in moments where he struggled. He says, man, this is the defining reality of my life. And it was the promise of eternity with God. That David said if he was with God, nothing could take him away from him. Because the good shepherd was with him, and a good shepherd protects him. The same thing's true for you. Look, I don't know whether you feel like you're lying in green pastures right now, or if you feel like you're walking through the valley. But here's what I do know. You worship a good God. A God that loves you and a God that cares for you. And he's a God that's with you. And at the peace that he offers you, it's not a peace that comes through a changing of our circumstances, but it's peace in knowing who walks beside us. Let's pray. God, I thank you for who you are. God, I thank you that you're a God of love. God, I thank you that you're a God of care. God, Psalm 23 is a beautiful reminder from David that you do not leave us to our own struggles, God, but that you are here walking every step of the way with us, providing everything we need, providing rest in the chaos, God, and providing peace in the midst of our fears and anxiety. And so, God, I just pray over everybody in this room, God, that they would know that peace. God, that we would know a peace that surpasses understanding, God, one that we can't explain. God, we just know that it's better. Help us to seek that. God, help us to seek it in all the practical ways that you've given us, but God, help us to seek it first and foremost in your presence, God, through a growing relationship with you. God, because that's what matters most. You are our shepherd. God, and we thank you for walking with us in the valley. God, we love you. We praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.